All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the March 27th President's Management Advisory Board meeting. My name is Brad Golson, the designated federal official for this board. Thank you all for joining us. Remind you, this is a public meeting, so for those present and those joining us via webcast, thank you for joining us. For those around the table, before you speak, remember that you must press the red button when you're done. It's probably in our best interest that we untap it. We can only have 3 mics open at one time. So again, thank you all for being here. With that, I'll turn it over to our chair, Beth Cobert.
All right, I'm starting by violating Brad's rule of turning on my button. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Apologies to folks here and those of you who might have been waiting on the webcast for our being slightly late. There was a long line of school kids waiting to get in to visit the Executive Office building in the White House today, and a number of people were behind us in line. We could probably slide down a little bit. We've got a broad agenda today to go through, and we're really excited about the conversation. I'd like to extend my thanks, as always, to the members of the President's Management Advisory Board for the time that they invest in helping us work towards our collective goals of helping make the government that we all here in D.C. and elsewhere around the country are working on more effective, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of the American public. And what we wanted to do today is to really engage in a dialogue on some of the places and get your input and comments, as well as the comments from the rest of the folks around the room, from the various agencies and agencies that are here, around how we can continue to make progress against the management agenda and the things we're doing. So with that, and I also wanted, and I'll go a little bit briefly because to make sure we've got time for the conversation, I wanted to just start with a brief update on some of the things and the work we've been doing on the management agenda. These members of the advisory board and others who couldn't be here today were really critical in both shaping the overall agenda and the action plans we've put in place to work against it. And I just feel like it's both our responsibility, all of you, and a good chance for all of us to step back and say, where are we going? What are we doing? I'd say overall, I think we are making really good progress, and we still have an opportunity-rich environment in front of us. And so more input and more good suggestions will be really helpful. If you flip to page 3, you'll find a slide, I guess it's, which has the core elements of the agenda, the purple, green, orange, blue slide, which is sort of the core we keep coming back to in terms of what are we trying to do. And we'll talk about a couple of these things today. The next slide, which I'm not going to go through in depth, we took these and made the management agenda goals, as you all know, part of the cross-agency priority goals. We're mandated through the GIPRA Modernization Act to have a set of cross-agency priority goals that we both are committed to deliver on. The faces of the accountable officials are up on performance.gov, and we are required to both set out plans and report on our progress quarterly to Congress and, importantly, to the American public. And so we post the results and how we're doing on performance.gov. What I've included in the deck today is a bit of a highlight, and I just wanted to call out a couple of things in terms of where we are. I'll come back to customer service at the end because we've done some things there. We continue to do a lot of focus, as you know, on smarter IT delivery. Effective IT is at the core, not just because we need IT to work well, but because we need the government to work well. You can't do anything in all of our lives today without technology touching it somehow. And so unless we get that right as part of the backbone, we will not be able to deliver. And Tony Scott is here today to join us, our new federal CIO. We'll hear from him a little bit later. We are thrilled that Tony is here and part of the team. We also, on the efficiency front, again, we want to make sure we're getting return for taxpayer dollars. We talked with this group in the past about benchmarking for administrative support functions. I have just completed my second round of visits to all the CXO councils, where we told them last year we were doing benchmarking and we're coming back. So I told them that I'm back, and we're coming back again next year. When we did this last year, we collected a set of data across administrative support functions. We collected about 40 different metrics, mostly around cost, virtually all around cost. And that was really helpful We had meetings with every single agency to talk about where they were and hear from them what it showed them about performance and performance gaps, both across agencies, but really importantly inside of agencies. Most of the agencies are an agglomeration of different activities, sometimes similar activities. In the case of EPA, you've got lots of regions or VA. In the case of the Department of Agriculture, you've got many, or Commerce, or HHS, or frankly, many places. You've got many different activities. You've got research activities. You've got citizen service activities. You've got statistical activities. And so the best comparators are often not always inside your agency because you've only got one sort of core research thing. You want to know how that compares to the research function at HHS or what's the National Science Foundation doing. So we both got the data at the component level, and with the support from GSA built a very, very simple tool that enables people to say, it's like very basic. These are the components. This is the metric I want to look at. These are the components. Show me the data. This year we'll have time series, and importantly, we are starting to add data on quality of service, and we'll come back to this when we talk about shared services later today. So with GSA support, we sent out a survey to 130,000 people, which in the federal government is actually a small survey, and have enough of a response rate from that that we can now use it to sort of look at cost and at least some indicators of quality for what we're doing. This is a big effort. And one of the things that we're really excited about is institutionalizing it, bringing it together, and doing it this year earlier in the spring so we can make it part of the budget formulation process. We'll hear more about shared services and category management a little bit later. We continue to do work on open data. We have a new U.S. Chief Data Officer at the federal government working in OSTP named DJ Patel. He's fantastic and is really going to take the ball forward. And lastly, one of the things I'm most excited about, and we'll hear about the employee engagement piece of this today, is the work we're doing on people and culture. I know this group contributed a lot of discussions early on around the SES Leadership Core. We have built those things into training programs, and we've also, I was telling Sam when we were chatting before the meeting, have created an advisory group of SES from across and senior leaders. There's SES, SL, ST, and Foreign Service, a bunch of different categories, across the federal government who are sort of an advisory group on how do we leverage the SAS we have, bring more great people into government, sort of revitalize the brand of that group. We've combined them with a number of the agencies where we're running pilots on different ways to manage and lead that group. And so we had that group and the chief human capital officers from the pilot agencies join us for a meeting last week. We formalized this group, and actually it was an incredible because the president came and spoke with this group for 45 minutes. Actually, the more accurate description is the president came and listened to this group for 45 minutes to hear their ideas, and his challenge to all of them was be bold, push harder, and it was an incredibly energizing experience. We also, building off the speech he gave to this group in December, we've ended up with a, actually, listserv of all the senior leaders across the federal government, which is a harder thing to get than you would think, but that's a different story. We can come back to that one later. But we now have it, and so we're trying to also think about how do we continue to communicate with that group and get tools out to them and talent out to them and sort of create a bunch of enthusiasm, and we're excited about that. We're doing a lot of things on engagement. You'll hear about from some groups later. I got to talk at the Department of Agriculture, had all their senior leaders together. Quite inspirational. How many? 300 plus folks in an auditorium talking about employee engagement, leadership effectiveness. The secretary was there. He was fantastic. So a bunch of good things. On customer service, a few things we owe back to you. Some of you will recall, I think it was 2 meetings ago, we had a discussion about customer service awards. I remember Liz's advice very clearly that if the guidance for the award was like longer than it would take to describe what a person had done, we had the wrong system in place. We've tried to execute that. It's not, I mean, it's probably a little longer than that, but not much. And basically, we have charged each agency with developing or leveraging a customer service program that recognizes individuals and teams providing direct frontline service. We've actually put that out. Agencies are starting to implement that. They will have nominations come back to us at the beginning of the summer, and we will then take those and have a presidential recognition in October. We are really excited about this because there's so much great stuff that happens, and we think it's a real opportunity. But we also took this group's advice. We didn't want to make this too prescriptive, and honestly, the way it works in each agency, the existing things they have are all a little different. So we've sort of said, the basic requirement is you need an awards program. It has to recognize frontline folks. It can't just recognize 10, but it can't recognize 10,000. So find the right number for you between that, and come back to us in the summer with people your agency thinks are great, and then we'll figure out how to both recognize them and find the best of the best.
Sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
Couldn't you have one government-wide award and then awards specific to each agency?
So the idea is these will come in together. There will be a presidential, that's sort of called the Presidential Customer Service Award. That's the whole thing. And then, but each agency's, the mechanism for trying to make it completely consistent will flow up through the agencies. It's a little easier to do it that way.
Yeah, I'm just thinking maybe the agent, and I'm sorry.
Go.
And maybe they're doing this already, but independent of the government-wide presidential award, the agencies themselves could be doing their own programs that are particularly suited to theirs, using the presidential one as a model.
That's the idea. Maybe I
Yeah.
didn't explain clearly. So the
I'm
idea
sorry.
is they sort of figure out what's the best way to do customer service recognition inside their agencies. And you've got the flexibility to do it for both individuals and teams. Of their group that they think gets their agency piece, those then get funneled up and we try and create a cross. I think
it.
that's what you
Yes,
mean?
Yes.
Good.
Thank you, sorry.
Then that's what we're doing.
Good.
We've also sort of, if you think about that as top down, we've started some stuff bottom up. We have a, 85% of the federal workforce does not sit in Washington, D.C. It's hard to think about when you're here, but it's true. And so lots of the service to citizens actually happens much closer to where Americans live. And so we've started an interagency customer service group in Denver. SSA, Carolyn is the agency lead on this, and she and her team have been phenomenal. And so SSA, there's a large federal government community actually in Denver. And so we've created a cross-agency group there of frontline folks. We had a workshop that I joined to kick off at the beginning of March. We had Schwab's call centers are actually based in Denver. And the guy who runs the Schwab call center came and talked to the group about how they think about client satisfaction, the journey they went on from sort of the depths to really good rankings and what that took and how they did that. I think the group found that really interesting. And so one of the things we can talk about is here or after is how we can leverage your personal experiences or folks on your team who are in different places. Because I think getting that out to the folks doing the work, I know the individuals in the room came away with some really specific ideas about what they wanted to do. There was a great description from him of, when they get a survey back where someone's unhappy, there's a hotline to the manager who reaches out, not to sort of critique the person doing the service, but to actually find the customer and find out what went wrong, how can I fix it, have we satisfied you? And so people took away from that a bunch of really, really tangible, actionable ideas. And we are working on this federal feedback button pilot that will be rolling out soon, both for online and places where we want to start in non-digital environments. SSA, again, has been at the forefront in volunteering to talk about how we do this. Very simple, right? How do you like it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically, and make it simple. And it's not perfect, but it'll give us a start. So more to come there. And the last piece, which I will leave for you later, but the other things this group has worked on, real estate. We now have we had freeze the footprint, you might recall. We now have reduce the footprint, which was released this week, thanks to Dave's great work, with actually real data about where the footprint is. So it's amazing to do a database strategy. We've got all sorts of other things. I just literally printed out, these are the last this week's blogs in the OMB thing on stuff we're doing on the agenda. So lots of impact. You guys should feel great about the contributions. And that was the whiz-bang version so we can get to the conversation. One of the places where we're doing a lot of work, building off of where we were on strategic sourcing, but frankly, looking at what worked and where we weren't getting the traction we felt like we should, is around strategic sourcing / category management. And how we move the ball forward there. Ann Rung, who's the administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, who was confirmed in
September.
Has been on a whirlwind, and I'm going to turn it over to Ann and have her describe a bit of what we're doing, and then also get some guidance from all of you. And I will encourage the rest of my colleagues in the room to both add questions and comments. I know all the people in this room, and this is not a shy group. So really, this meeting is most useful if it helps all of us individually move the ball forward. So as both a user and customer of category management or someone trying to do things, please feel free to chime in.
Thank you. So I think if you were asked to design the optimal structure for procurement or the optimal organizational structure to drive performance and efficiency, you would not come up with the current federal structure. So we have over 3,300 different contracting offices across the globe, that I know of, and lots of duplication of effort and very little visibility into what everyone else is doing, so absolutely almost no transparency. One of the results is that we have huge price disparity, so we're all paying vastly different prices for the very same items. And so, you know, I think a lot of well-intentioned acquisition reform legislation has had some unintended consequences. So at one point, for instance, in Reinventing Government, they called for an end to government monopolies. And they were talking about different functional areas, but one of the areas they were referring to was GSA being the sole entity to purchase IT acquisitions. So they wanted to bring that authority back to the agencies, but one of the unintended consequences was that we had this massive proliferation of IT contracts, very duplicative contracts across government. So we now have this model that we've got to do something with. And we'd like to create a very new framework for thinking about how we tackle this space. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have taken the $440 billion that we spend every year, and we've removed the weapons spending, so we're really left with what we think is common spend across government, which is about $270 billion in spend. And we've divided it into 10 super categories. And this was designed based on a DoD template and working with other large civilian agencies. And this is really sort of a guiding and organizational principle for us moving forward on how we tackle this major sort of initiative. And I've met with a lot of companies like Macy's and Boeing to talk to them about how they do category management. I've talked to the UK about how they've done category management. But what I've found is that no one has really tried it on this scale. So in the UK, they're talking about 14 billion in common spend. Boeing and other companies like Macy's is much smaller. So how do you really tackle $270 billion in common spend? How do you bring some organization and transparency into the space? So the way I'm thinking about tackling this is really in two ways. One, thinking about it in phases. So I think phase one would be just shedding light and bringing transparency into existing government-wide solutions contracts, into pricing information so our contracting officers can better negotiate pricing, bringing transparency into best practices, so providing common templates. So a really critical piece of this category management is what GSA is designing, the Acquisition Gateway, which we'll walk you through. So it's an online site where contracting officers can go to find, one, the existing government-wide contracts, so they're not going out to the market and creating new duplicative contracts. Two, where they can find pricing information for the first time, ideally prices paid, but we're starting with prices offered. And also best practices, so can we give them templates for statements of objectives? So we're moving away from the 200-page overly prescriptive government-specific RFPs to sort of something that's a little more streamlined. So Laura will walk you through that.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, absolutely.
If I can just
interrupt.
Yeah,
Please do.
I just want to interrupt though. I mean the question though is, so people get on the GSA schedule, and what we've been told repeatedly is that every time that an agency wants to go out and get a new service, whatever it is, they negotiate directly with the vendor set and get a different set of prices than what is available on the GSA schedule.
Yeah.
And so that's done every time is what we were told. And so so the question is, that seems like a pretty broken system. And
Yeah.
how do you centralize that system? And what we had discussed was, let's say in IT, having the telecommunications category, having an expert who would be so good at the notion of negotiating with the carriers that no one would want to go around them. They would say,
Right.
this person is the very best at dealing with AT&T, Verizon, the usual suspects. So there'd be a real incentive to leverage that expertise. They would know what the prices were, they would know what was done previously, and each agency wouldn't negotiate separately.
Yeah, Dan Tangerlini used to sometimes refer to the schedules as perhaps like Kodak, decades ago, and so it's probably an antiquated model. Having said that, they're negotiating these master contracts based on a volume of 1. So every agency is indeed expected to then negotiate further off of that contract. But yes, you then end up having 2 or 3 layers beyond that master contract. But that is a nice lead-in to kind of how we're thinking about category management, where you have teams of experts really running these categories.
And I think the gap, because I know this group had a lot of conversations about this in category management. The challenge I think we had in trying to implement that, because honestly, the concepts are still the same. It's this path to implementation that got in our way, right? We all would nod our heads and agree. Trying to persuade or even mandate, right, that agencies go through this, like there was no data. There was no way to sort of convince somebody who wouldn't then go around the system that really, like, you're paying too much, it's costing too much. So, like, one of the things, and that's why we sort of stepped back and said, how do we get back to this vision that all of you had helped us develop, is this lack of transparency was really a problem. Like, you really didn't know. And so getting something there that actually helps people do that is sort of one of the things we went back and said, without that, we can't get there. We still are going to, by the way, put in place a category manager. In fact, our job description for the IT category manager
Just went out today. So this would be our first government-wide full-time category manager.
So, but it was at least my view was, we had the right concept, sort of the implementation effort kept stalling, and I think it's because we didn't have the data to get both ourselves there or anybody else there.
On the point of the data, and I think it's great that you're starting with just basically getting the facts and what the data is. And while this is on a obviously much greater scale, I think all of us in corporate America have experienced something very similar to this. And one of the things that's it's pretty obvious, and therefore you're probably doing it, but one of the things we discovered, we had 150,000 employees, every one of which thought they were free to hire, I'll make it up, it's a consulting firm that begins with an M. Just it's imaginary.
And a lot of people around this table have worked for them.
And the problem was everybody was cutting their own deal. So what we did was we asked the firm itself, the vendor, to provide us with that data, as opposed to trying to collect it internally, which is very hard to do. So the deal was, I went to the senior relationship partner and I said, tell me everybody who's using you and what they're paying, and on condition of doing business with us. So if you use a kind of Pareto approach and hit the really big billers in these different categories, and rather than try to collect it internally, make it the job of the vendor to tell you what they're doing. And then you can, because they have the data. They know exactly who's paying what. And they have it, they can press a button and give it to you, which is a lot faster than you trying to collect it yourself.
And we found that when I was at Department of Commerce with Ellen, where we were trying to collect prices paid for Dell computers. We attempted to get that from our bureaus, and we discovered Dell had the information in a snap, and it was better information. Right.
That's a good point.
But here's what happens. Everybody ends up, so we had these issues, as Jeff said, and what we had to do is we used to measure every quarter at the executive level. We would see what we called spend under management by category. And so what would happen is, if you pick your category, that got rolled up to the executive team, and the executive team then had the ability to go back and say, no, we don't have the target percentage under management. And then they'd look at each executive and say, Tony, what are you doing? Because you're at 22%, and we said we'd be at 40% spend under management in this category. And so if you can't measure spend under management consistently, and there's no ability to say, yes, we will hit our target of X percent by Y date, and everybody's held some level of accountability. And my question really comes down to, as a CEO of a company, I had the ability to hold people very accountable. How do you hold people accountable to hit that spend under management target? Because otherwise, I don't think you'll get there.
No, that's a fair point. So on first, how do you baseline spend under management? How do you even know what spend is under management? We spent the last 3 months coming up with a methodology to really track this across government, creating a sort of three-tiered approach, so level 1, level 2, level 3 being the most mature spend under management, and we're not at level 3 for anything, and that would be when you have a government-wide solution and a full-time government-wide category manager. But we have some agencies in level 1, so we've begun to collect that data, and we're close to revealing that number of where we are at level 1 spend under management. When I talked a little bit about how do you approach such a massive enterprise, you know, to really try to drive home category management, and the way we're approaching it is not just in phases, but we want to go deep into one category, and we're starting with IT because there's a lot of momentum around it. It made the GAO high-risk list. We've got Tony's great talent. And so we are.
Of a new law called FATARA that requires us to
yes,
do
and we
some new
have
things.
some data through the portfolio stat process. So it made sense to us to start there. We are now going out to hire our first IT category manager who will report to Tony. So in their performance plan will be, one of the metrics will be how much spend is under management. We also want to set a goal for ourselves as part of a dashboard that we present to the president, who asked for it quarterly, on where we are as spend under management. And we think that'll be a good incentive for our agencies.
And are the agency heads incented in any way? So how do they benefit? How does the agency head benefit from participating in the program?
So I'm going to ask some of the agency folks.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my friends on that side of the room. Ellen or Ned or anybody else want to?
So hi, I'm Ellen Herbst from Commerce. I'm the CFO ASA here for our DepSec. As Ann mentioned, she was at Commerce, and she got us started on we were calling it strategic sourcing back then. And we are true believers because we have experienced the savings. And when we started, it was ahead of sequestration and budget caps, and the savings we saw overall in the department were obviously part of protecting more mission dollars. Now, having said that, I want to make a point around that and then make a suggestion as well. So what we did find was the dollars that would, the cost avoided, if you will, was not obvious enough to the individual program managers on the mission side. So we've recognized we have to do a much better communication job to sell them on the benefits. That's number one. And number two, the acquisition staff, it takes work to collect all this data, come up with requirements that everybody will agree to, and then frankly force people down the chute of these contracts. And I wanted to share, some of you, I know Dave has heard this, but we are also engaged in a shared service initiative in Commerce, and one of the areas is acquisitions. And we are a very data-driven agency. We discovered that 88% of our transactional activity in the acquisition shops were on what's called the simplified acquisition threshold dollar level, which is buying something under $150,000. 88% of the activity, 18% of the spend. What that did for our acquisition people is go, holy cow, if we can find somebody else to do this for us, B, dive into what that represents in terms of what we're buying, and make it more automatic, all of a sudden we've got the acquisition people pretty excited about the idea of working on this, because what they see is in a time of diminishing acquisition workforce, you know, putting their best people on our most important mission critical, unique buys, and letting somebody else deal with what is commodity stuff. So just offer that. That's pretty new data.
I know, I'm shocked.
I know. Well, it's the old 80-20 rule, right? So yeah, it was transformational in the thinking of our acquisition leaders when they saw that data. So
can I just add, Beth?
Question. Yeah.
Just talking about how to get employees to buy in and understand there's enough benefit to them. For us, we started a process about 3 years ago, Blueprint for Stronger Service, shared services, strategic sourcing, When finally folks kind of woke up, is when we saved $1 billion, no furloughs, no RIFs, all the things that would have normally have happened otherwise. And folks in van pools were seeing, on Fridays, they're not full because other agencies were having cuts. We did not. And that's how the light bulb went on. It actually does make a difference.
Krista Harden is the Deputy Secretary at Ag. And
sorry.
folks, both for the benefit of our guests who don't all get to go to meetings with you all the time, and for the folks who are joining us on the webcast, if you could just say who you are before you speak, it will just help folks put your remarks in context. Thanks, Krista.
Thank you.
Ron, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Just a couple of comments and questions. One is there a, excuse me, thank you. Is there a development of tools that are shared? Because it seems that the data analysis, the collecting of the information, as well as the communication tools that help demonstrate the impact on the average employee, if each agency has to develop that, that's a kind of arduous process, as opposed to thinking about this as a toolkit that can be shared and made appropriate so that people can really focus on the task as opposed to figuring out the infrastructure. The other comment I would make centers around reporting intervals. And if you think about reporting intervals on mission critical activities, if you do it quarterly, you basically get 4 bites of the apple a year. If you do it monthly, you get 12 bites of the apple. And if you're thinking about performance improvement on something that's important, personally, I'd rather have 12 opportunities than 4. Now, somewhere in there, each group has to find what the right answer is for them. But I would think deeply about the reporting interval and earning the right to less frequent reporting intervals.
That is a real...
So, when you hit a certain amount of spend under management, you get to go to every other month or every third month or whatever. But I would encourage you to think about how to apply that.
That's probably a huge incentive for the agencies,
really, all right, so
more than money.
I'll put that down as one of many, but that is a great idea. There are many great ideas, but that's one we can actually
Yes.
I'm going to take your comment about tools. We are trying to build some tools. And I think what this conversation illustrates to me is sort of where, as we were trying to implement sort of the same principles that you guys had talked to us about, sort of where we honestly got a little bit stuck. Yeah. And it was partly this tools and data that we sort of, like you'd say to people, should we do this? And they would nod their heads because of course you should do it. But as we moved, we got a little bit stuck. And so I want to talk, I'm going to just do Laura, if you can do the quick go through of the basic tools we're working through to try and do this. Except
and this is just a question that may actually be a segue to that comment. But Ann, how do you know let's just use IT since that's where you're focused. Yeah. We talked about a couple concepts. One was spend under management, and then Jeff's example was trying to understand total spend. How do you know that the number is $50 billion? And one of the problems.
Great point.
Yeah, the other
because
problem.
I don't know it's $50 billion.
Okay, because we had heard in prior sessions that some of the procurement is so deeply embedded within the agencies, it's very hard to ferret out all of that spend. So is this just your kind of rough guess at this, or do you really feel like you have better data now than you had, say, a year ago or 2 years ago when we talked about this?
So great question. This is a very rough cut, and I know it's not accurate. And so the first job of the category manager is going to be to dig through this data and really tell us what is the spend for IT. Yeah. We don't know that. It is embedded in other categories. And so this $270 billion will change.
Sorry, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but you do know, again, using an 80-20 approach, you do know who the vendors are.
We do.
So why not ask the vendors how much we're spending with them?
So the vendors, a particular company may have lots of different spend areas, and sometimes the IT is buried under a contract for professional services or some other service, so it's very difficult to get at what exactly is your IT spend. But I think if you can get to the level 2 and 3 data, you'll have a clearer picture.
Using the vendors as part of this process is a
I'm just saying.
to pursue.
I'm just saying, if you know who the vendors are, ask them how much we're spending with them and in what categories. And they may account for it differently than we do, but that's going to be extremely accurate information.
You know, the problem is, at least as I've seen it, you've got primes and you've got subcontractors, and so that's going to, that indirection is actually going to make it much more complex than the M example you gave. But it's still a worthy endeavor.
Absolutely, and we will start with the vendors.
Can I just, I'm sorry to keep jumping in, but I want to go back to Enrique's original question and Ellen's comments just for a minute. So the problem I've experienced in this field is that the true believers are the ones that really do experience savings. They're not the problem. The problem are the people that are cutting their own deals that think that they will do better than if they participate in the whole. So the trick to me is you've got to find a way of, and you can't just discipline them and say, you know what, for the sake of the greater good, we're going to make you pay more. That's against human nature. So the trick, and human nature prevails in most organizations, not always, but I think the trick is to find a way to share the overall savings, even with those people that may today be paying less because they're cutting their own deals. Because they're the ones that are going to be the problem, in my experience. People like Ellen who totally get it and are benefiting from it, they're going to be all over it. But there's agencies in this government, I'm guessing, that are out there cutting their own deals, and their view is, stay away from me because I can do better without you. And they're going to be the problem. So you've got to find going back to your original question, you've got to find a way to incentivize them to participate for the greater good.
That's a great point. And I think every agency can always point to a one-off to say, I can find this less expensively. And we have to reinforce the point that in its totality, it's a savings for their agency. Fair point.
Can we do the
Yes, let's walk you through
the tool?
Yes.
So this tool is designed to support category management and really shed a light on existing contracting solutions. So we heard from our contracting officers, they have no idea what existing contracts are already out there. So they go out to the open market. They don't have access to pricing data or best practices. We want to have every contracting officer go to this site every morning before they start their day.
So, thank you, Ann. Laura Stanton, General Services Administration, head of the Common Acquisition Platform. So this is the acquisition gateway, and as we're talking about tools, and as we're talking about the changes, it's a massive change management effort that we need to drive throughout government. And it needs to occur on two levels. It needs to occur what I think of as the institutional level, where we have the spend under management, we have the documentation, and it needs to occur at the contracting officer and the requiring officials level, who need to understand how to build those requirements and what options are available for them to buy through that may already exist, and how to actually put all of that into process to change how we think about how we acquire within government. So as you see, the theme of this is acting as one to address that for smarter acquisition. So that's what we're doing. We're building this infrastructure, and this tool has been available since October 1st. We're syncing it up to the categories and very much aligning it to the different categories that Ann's showing, and so that when somebody's looking to buy, they come in, and since we're short on time, I will go through this quickly. They go into the acquisition gateway, and what they're seeing here is actually what do they want if they're buying administrative support, IT software, IT hardware, professional services. So if I go into the IT hardware category, what the first things that they see are, and as soon as the computer wakes up and actually does it, the other piece, so the first things they see are compare the solutions. These are the government-wide solutions that are available to them, so they don't have to go and do that one-off comparison. And one of the first things we heard is people don't even know what's available, what Ann was just saying. So you go in, you take a look at the different contracts that are available, and my apologies about the speed of the connection. So what it does is it lists all contracts that are available across the government. And seeing a PDF of contracts may seem very simplistic. It may seem like this is about 10 years out of date. This is the first time that we've done it. Okay, so let me just be very clear. That gathering this data, even understanding what's available within these categories, is a massive effort. So we're starting with the most simplistic data access. Put the contracts in front of people. put the historical pricing data where we have it, which is very, very limited, in front of people.
But we'll have more at the end of the month.
We will have more, and I'm very excited about that. And then we begin to put the expert advice in front of people. So how do you build an acquisition plan? How do you develop solid requirements? Federal Strategic Sourcing Initiative for common requirements for desktops, laptops. How do we begin to put all of this in front of somebody who may buy a laptop once every few years? And so we begin to share that and start with what I think of as the retail behavior change of the individuals. The other piece is contracting officers and people with requirements are really looking for community. So what we've done is we've actually built out a community here so that they can start to connect to one another. It's not, we're a long way for a government Facebook, but it's a start where people can post a question and begin to engage. And so while what we're seeing at the OFP, at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, is the institutionalization and driving it that way, we're trying to change the behavior on the lower level, on the working level of the people making these decisions, and that's part of it. The other piece I'd like to highlight is also, with the emphasis on IT, we're beginning to put up how do you engage the digital services playbook? How do you use the tech FAR? How do you manage to actually buy IT without asking for a policy change? It's possible. We've done it. But it also is something that if you're not accustomed to it, you don't know how. So this is beginning to put up the resources so people can understand how others have done it. So we're trying to really tackle this on two levels. There's a number of resources in here. I promised Beth I wouldn't go through all of them, but the goal here is...
We're happy to show people, or you can...
I think it's great. What kind of uptake are you getting?
We are seeing about, it's slow at this point because we're still building out all the materials. And so I don't want people going there without having something there.
Sure.
So we've been really focused on building about 75 to 100 users a week at this point. Right. And then we're also planning on beginning to put in tools and digital services that would allow somebody to actually immediately go into the transaction.
One of the things that I imagine will be useful over time, just going back to this point about true believers versus not true believers, is to track which agencies are using it and which ones aren't.
Yes.
That would be revealing.
And one of our metrics for category management will be how many unique users we get to this site.
So we're looking at all of those things. We're looking at how do we build this in a very thoughtful way? How do we also put the tools in place so that somebody can actually put together their cost estimates, put together all of their tools using data from other agencies so they can see if they're actually paying more or if they're out of sync with others. And we're trying to think about how to present that in a very, as I said, a very thoughtful way to get without overwhelming people.
And this was developed with lots of input from our frontline contracting officers.
Yes, it was. So we spend most of our time actually understanding their needs. As we get the data, as we get the spend under management, all of that, as well as the analysis tools, will be up here to begin to move it forward on the more institutional level as well. So that's what we've been working on to support.
Great. And just one thing that I'm thinking through is that I recognize some of us are only here for a few years. So how do we really institutionalize category management? It's at least a 5-year process. And so at least 5 years. And so, are there regulations, bless you, are there regulations that we should be thinking about? Really, how do we embed this in the sort of DNA of the federal organization?
Beth, this is Stan Myberg with the Environmental Protection Agency, and I want to come back sort of to a thread of this conversation, which is what incents people. And at least we are not the size at EPA of some of my partners around the room in terms of how many procurements we do, but I will guarantee you that what incents people is scarcity, at least in my agency. We do not have the resources to do things the old way. We know that. Some of the challenges we have, though, are not the hard stuff or even the numbers, it's the soft stuff. It's culture, what I will call the power of myth. And since we're on IT, I can give you a perfect example. I came into this job from having been in regional offices, and EPA went through a process in headquarters to come up with a centralized provider of IT services. Well, it was so bad, or reportedly so bad, that in the regional offices, they said they would do anything but get that provider. And so we did not do a good job of holding the provider to service standards. But what people heard is, oh my God, you're not gonna make us get that centralized system. And so you really have to struggle with that. The other thing we struggle with in my agency as a culture matter is status for people who are doing acquisitions. The heroes of EPA tend to be engineers, scientists, lawyers. They tend not to be people who do contracts, procurements, acquisition. So we got to address that one head on, along with some first-line supervisor issues. But that is a cultural issue that we have to do, and to have folks who are engineers and scientists and lawyers recognize that without these other folks, you can wave your arms all you want, but you won't get anything done. So those are two issues we have.
Beth, I'm Victor Mendez. I'm the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Transportation. Some really good points that have been raised. I don't know if it's a cultural issue or maybe a recognition of the politics of the world that we're in. But, you know, the issue that was raised, you know, does this get embedded in a system that survives the politics? Because, you know, this administration, we know, is here for another couple of years. And I think what I heard from our folks, of course, we want to be more efficient, and there are some cultural issues that have been in place for a long time, so you got to work your way through that. But I think what people recognize, they were saying is, okay, you know, we understand your philosophy. We want to be more efficient, and we can actually save money and reinvest in our own company, if you will. But what's going to happen with the next administration, not knowing who that will be? Will they have the same management philosophy, or will they take the savings and redeploy it on their own? So I think those are some of the issues that we face. You know, given where we are today, I think we're doing a very good job at trying to figure out where we are, where we can save. The benchmarking efforts actually raised a lot of questions that, to me, kind of demonstrated culturally how people view the world within at least DOT. And a lot of reasons why we shouldn't get this data or how we compare and all that kind of stuff, which was actually pretty interesting to hear from our folks. But I think once you get through that, I think the long-term implications of, you know, how does this play out 4 years from today is actually a very important question for our folks, because they're going to be here 4 years from now, and we're not.
Yeah, I think that's a very practical and real-world concern that people have. And my experience is you have to present it as a bit of a no-regrets strategy or tactic, meaning that they are better off reaping the savings and figuring out how to get the work done in a world of fewer resources, whether the current policy continues or there's a new policy, because there won't be more resources no matter who is in. There simply is going to be a world of increasingly financial constraints. And I think having that conversation in a plain English way gets people focused on the fact that figuring out how to be more productive is really in their own best interest.
I do think, though, that your comments place more pressure on your team with the acquisition gateway to get it right, because it can act as this operating system that transcends administrations. And if people get used to using it, and it's a community type of portal where people are learning from one another, and they're using it day to day, they're going to continue using it across administrations. So I think it's really, really important that you get this right, and I understand your view of let's make sure that we have a good critical mass of information available before we get too many people on here, because we don't want to turn them away.
All right. I would just say in closing, acquisitions is very much a team sport, and so we're working closely with the CIO community, the CFO community, the human capital officers, which is key, which is a combination of career and political people. And also, I would love to share with you the new ad we have out, and position description for a full-time IT category manager. Would love to have you circulate that. And our heading here is join the Executive Office of the President and help transform how we buy over $50 billion worth of information technology. And the subheading is probably, and tell us if it's $50 billion or not.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks, Laura. And thanks, everybody, for the comments. I think, as always, we've come out of this with some good things to think about, as well as a few practical things we can do, like starting tomorrow, which is always, probably starting tomorrow, actually, knowing this team. I want to take a couple minutes, and I think we'll squeeze the time. And, we have a break that's 15 minutes long, which is always the excuse to make it slightly shorter, and turn the floor over to Tony Scott. Tony is in week 4 or 5? 6. Oh, my gosh. Tony joined us 6 weeks ago as the federal CIO. His incredibly impressive bio, which you all can read, is in the paper. I think beyond all of those great accomplishments, when we were talking to Tony about joining the team, I was impressed by any number of things. One was his passion for the topic of how we can use IT to transform the federal government so it really works better for the American people. 2, his just calm wisdom about thinking about how do you make change at this scale happen, and how do you do this from the center. I know when Tony was interviewing and talking to us, and we were having him come in and talk to some folks here in this building, he said to me, well, that's great, and I'm happy to talk to you and whoever you want, but I actually want to go talk to some people in the agencies, because if I'm going to make this job and have it work, those are the people I'm going to work with, and that's where change is going to happen. Those of us sitting in this building are actually not where change happens at scale, and so I want to go talk to those folks and see who are going to be my partners in change and in making the path forward. And at the end of that question, I was like, okay, I'm done. And so we are thrilled that Tony is here. He's going to just share some initial thoughts, and we will have him back to talk more, because there's an unending set of things we can talk about here. But I wanted to make sure that he had a chance to get to know you guys. I think he probably knows some of you already. And over to Tony.
Well, thanks, Beth. I appreciate the warm introduction. So it's actually been a great few weeks, and I hadn't spent a lot of time in the federal government space prior to taking on this role, except for a few years ago. I was on the Board of Assessment at NIST, so I only kind of saw the federal government through those lens. Although in my prior roles, I've certainly had lots of sessions with executives from the various IT organizations across the federal government, usually trying to help sell something or share what our common experience was. I think the focus, and I did a couple of sort of introductory speeches this week, my focus is really, I think, shaping up to be something I call land the plane, which is we've had a bunch of good initiatives get started and a lot of good thinking around strategy and design and so on. And it's now time to realize some of those things and make them scale across the government. So we've got good things going on in a number of spaces, but now we've just got to grow them and institutionalize them in a way that's much stronger than I think where we're at today. I think there's 3 sort of main areas that I would sort of describe as areas of focus. The first one, and probably the most obvious one in some sense, is just cyber. We're, from a security perspective, this is the issue of our era, whether it's this year or next year. This is certainly a huge issue. And sort of one of the perspectives that I have there is that this is a space that's, obviously very rapidly moving, and one that is going to require some innovation and creativity on the part of what we do. In typical institutional fashion, and I've seen this in private enterprise as well as the government so far, efforts are often quite siloed. And one of the things that I'm starting to talk to our folks about is I think cyber can be addressed as just another form of a quality issue. It's risk, and it's the combination of things that you do that has an outcome. And so we're having some kind of interesting conversations with the cyber community already about what can we do if we look at it a little bit differently than just the towers. And so in our world, we think of security as, you know, the device, the network, the software that's on it, you know, the building and all those kinds of things. And Enrique will know this space really well. But you have to look at what the combination of all those things are. And, you know, you could think of it as a quality problem if you have some issues. The second area, and we've spent a lot of time alluding to it here, is just cost. We've had a number of great initiatives underway, data center consolidation, this spend management will result in a lot of good work. There's probably two areas I would highlight there. One is the way we develop applications and institutionalize a new way of developing applications is under fundamental change in the federal government. We have, you know, many examples of programs that have gone on for years, cost a lot of money, and ended up delivering a lot less than what was expected. And so there's some good efforts underway to institutionalize more agile development methodologies and deliver things on a pace of, you know, every few months versus, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 years out. And it's both an attention span as well as a process and technique that I think holds lots of promise. The lot of efforts underway around data and, you know, how we can leverage that across the government, but also make it available to the American people so that it can be a source of economic growth or an economic engine. And then the last space I would highlight is just a people agenda. Again, many of you would recognize this problem in the organizations that you have been a part of, but we have a whole generation of IT leadership in the federal government that's about ready to retire in the next few years. These are the, you know, pioneers. They've been here for a long time. They've provided, you know, leadership and management, but many are going to retire, and we have to do things to grow our leadership, grow our capability, particularly in these new areas. And so we're going to have a very strong sort of people skills agenda. In that sense, one of the teams that we have is a team called the Digital Services Team that we're using to surgically insert in each agency to help bring new skills and new approaches, including this agile development. And the early indications of this are that it's delivering great value, and we've got some great examples where, whether it's you know, healthcare.gov or things at immigration or other areas where things have been delivered much more quickly and with much less cost than what would have taken place otherwise. But those teams, both centralized and distributed into the agencies as well as in GSA so that those resources can be contracted, form a central strategy around injecting a new sort of digital services orientation to our approach for developing and delivering software and assisting with the various business processes in each of the agencies. The last thing that I'll say is we have a new law, FITARA, that we're in the process of providing the right guidance for the agencies on. This strengthens the role of the CIO, puts very clear accountabilities on the role of the CIO. But you know, good agencies are already following a lot of those practices. Some agencies aren't. And I think it's going to call on the leadership of every agency, not just the CIO, to be a lot more engaged in how IT is done and be responsible for the outcomes of those kinds of projects. So I'm very encouraged by the conversations and dialogue that we're having with the agencies. We've got a lot of great input on how to go implement that. And I think at the end of the day, done right, it'll be a very good thing for both cost, but probably more importantly, speed of delivery, which today is the most precious commodity in some sense.
That sounds fabulous. I just wanted to make a comment that goes back to what the gentleman from the EPA, sorry, Stan, which I thought was a really good insight, which is that in many organizations, functions like IT are not seen as mission critical the way you were describing. And it strikes me, Tony, that you have a really unique opportunity to create a community of the CIOs across the organization that makes them feel that they are a community beyond the particular job they have, that they are recognized, that they have a very prominent leader in yourself. And, you know, I'd just encourage you to, you know, which you're probably doing anyway, to think about helping them feel that importance, both with respect to the government as a whole and with respect to the agencies they're in. And having somebody like you in this job really lends itself to that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I would, just a few comments. One, thank you for joining and agreeing to serve. It's really something that will have a very big impact on us here. You did mention a few things about cyber, and I want to leverage off one of Jeff's comments, which is any executive who has to face a cyber breach instantly understands the value of a chief information officer. Yes. So I would encourage you to leverage that opportunity to avoid any executive finding themselves in those circumstances, because it's something that you do not want to have to deal with. And I think generally the customer orientation towards social, mobile, online banking, all the things that people now do represents a very important lever to help, again, position the CIO as a external communication and entry point in terms of social, mobile, and digital activity.
So just to continue, so Tony, it's great to have you in this role. One of your peers in the private sector once said, as you move to the cloud, it gives you freedom from choice. So one of the initiatives here was this notion of how do we go cloud first for a lot of things. And I think there's been some barriers as the public sector has tried to adopt some of these cloud initiatives. And I'd like you to look at that a little bit more and see what have been the barriers to the adoption of some of these new cloud services, because I think it will give you the ability to move more agilely where you can, because you don't have to build it all yourself. And you've seen this in spades, given the things you've done. And so I'd like to just ask you to look at what have been some of the barriers to adopting some of these services.
Sure. Actually, I'm deep into this already, and one of the observations we've made, this is part of also the data center consolidation effort that we've had. And it turns out, at least the preliminary look that I have so far, is that we don't have a high level of digital asset management in the data centers for the applications and the things that are running in the data center. So in the past, we've asked people to go inventory things. It's required somebody to go out with a clipboard and a barcode scanner and run around and figure out. And one of my experiences in Microsoft and at Disney was, if you don't have that digital asset management and it's real and it's timely, it's hard to do things like figure out which of these applications can I reduce capacity on or leverage virtualization for. What are the common things that I can do that I could move to the cloud? All of those kinds of things become just very hard. The second thing that we've identified is while a lot of the cloud services today tend to be more, I'll say, consumer application oriented, we've identified a couple of critical services that we're very, very close with the big cloud providers that if we just get over that hump, then it forms the building blocks for a bunch of applications that we could then go leverage cloud technology a lot more fully than we are today. So I think we're, at that sort of very interesting point where we're, that close, and it's going to take just a little bit more push, and then we're over the top of the hill.
So I'm going to play time cop and say we're going to come back to this because I actually think it'd be great to come back to this group when Tony's been here a little longer than his 6 weeks.
That's fair.
And on your point on cyber, I'm looking around at my colleagues on the PMC and wondering if, I think when we went through our agenda for last year, if you think about, and this, right, this is at the deputy secretary level, right? This is not, who have overall sort of operational oversight. It was the, that and people and culture were the two topics that we had covered the most often at PMC, which pretty much meant that we had a discussion about cyber every month, and they would share your comment, Ron, about if, as one of them once said, if you haven't had one yet, you will. So, I think I can confidently say that all of them would feel that they have real ownership for the role they play as overall organizational leaders. It is not a delegated authority. It has come up again and again, and in fact, we will be talking about it next week. So, because that's the only way you can actually get there. So I'm going to shift gears again. Sorry for the moving things along here. One of the other places where I know we've had some conversations with this group, and as we're trying to sort of move the ball forward, is around shared services. Dave Mader also joined the team last year as the controller. Dave brings a phenomenal set of experiences. He was a longtime, incredibly distinguished career civil servant, most senior career civil servant in the IRS, with a tremendous record of achievement in that role, then left and went to the private sector, and then we had the opportunity to steal him back last year, and he has really taken this agenda on. Dave has many great characteristics. There's too many to name, but one is I think he knows every senior financial management leader inside every single agency in the federal government, and when you're trying to make change happen, this is really a valuable secret weapon. So with that, I will turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Beth. Let me introduce Beth Angerman. Beth, actually, this is going to be an interesting conversation because Beth is actually part of the Treasury Department with Brody, and she leads within Treasury the Office of Financial Innovation and Technology, which was set up about 2 years ago to actually operationalize the President's management agenda with regard to shared service. Because when you think about shared services, I mean, the government has been on a 20-year journey on shared services, and it's been a little bit fits and starts and a little bit haphazard. And I think the recognition in the President's second term that if we really needed to make progress, which I think we've all talked about certainly in the context of acquisitions, and it applies to the rest of the administrative functions, that there needed to be a way of institutionalizing it and creating the framework, the governance, the processes that were uniform across government. So OMB 2 years ago went and asked Treasury, would you serve as our agent? And Beth has been leading that organization since its inception. Now, the focus has been primarily for the last 2 years around financial management and financial management systems. When you look at shared services, obviously we're talking much broader than that. We're talking about acquisition, we're talking about human capital, we're talking about IT. What we want to touch on, and I'm going to ask Beth to talk a little bit about some of the progress that we've made over the last 2 years with regard to financial management, recognizing that we need to broaden the scope, and some of the challenges that we are facing that we want really to get your insight in are some of the things that we've talked about. It's, how do you create the business case? How do you create the incentive to move the organization? How do you manage the change process within a very large, diverse organization? So, Beth?
Thank you, Dave. So I'm, to give everybody context, I'm looking at page 15. So I think, excuse me, I think the first thing we should start at is looking at the current landscape of shared services today, and really recognizing the fact that the departments have organically, if you will, almost over the last 20 years, really stood up these organizations and building their own subject matter experts for a lot of these mission support functions. And building and establishing that expertise, and then taking it a step further, which I think in the spirit of good government is offering those services to other agencies. And we've seen a lot of those relationships grow over the years, and I think to Stan's point is, they need to continue to grow now. We need to continue to mature these organizations because we're seeing less resources dedicated to these mission support functions and more focus on the mission critical functions. So a lot of credit due to these agencies, and you can see that while we're talking about financial management, and that's really within my scope, you can see that they offer services much broader than financial management. So the question really becomes, if I'm a customer and I'm looking for shared services, I'm rarely just shopping for financial management. I'm looking for shared services in all of these other mission support functions, and where can I go, and who's managing these organizations across these lines of business, and who's establishing these marketplaces or this ecosystem, if you will, of shared services, and how are we making sure that we're creating an ecosystem that is competitive, but also leveraging all of the good work that these agencies have done to build these organizations to date.
I'm sorry, just a point of clarification of vocabulary. We're talking about shared services within an agency, not across agencies.
Both.
We're talking both.
Okay, so when these X's are here, they refer to both?
They could be servicing the
Large.
entire department and then bringing on external
Yep.
parties.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, so why isn't there an X in everyone in the column that says payroll? So for example, there's Department of Transportation, it says there's no X in payroll. So what does that mean?
So payroll, when I mentioned that we've been on this 20-year journey, it actually began 20 years ago with the beginnings of consolidation of payroll providers. In the 25 years ago, every department was doing their own thing, you know, including when I worked at the IRS, we ran our own payroll. It's like, this is insane. Why am I doing this?
Right.
It's not, you know, it's not part of my mission. So it took literally 20 years to consolidate down to these 4 payroll providers. So these 4 support the entire U.S. government.
So at least at OMB, we get paid through the DFAS, Defense Finance and Accounting Service. That's who issues our direct deposits. I was going to say paychecks, but we don't get paychecks.
Right.
I'm Ned Holland. I'm the Assistant Secretary at Health and Human Services. I'm here for our Deputy Secretary, who is actually about to leave the department. Just to emphasize what Beth says, we operate a thing called the Program Support Center, which began back in the mid-'90s. Vice President Gore had a project called Reinventing Government, and the Program Support Center was created back then. We do pretty close to $1 billion worth of business. 60 to 70% of it is done outside the Department of Health and Human Services. It's for virtually every major department is a customer of ours for one purpose or another. So it really is a shared service effort.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to go back to my question. So I know it's a journey, but in payroll, right, I was on the board of one of those providers called ADP and no longer. But the point is, payroll is something that has a lot of complexity to it when you really understand it.
Yeah.
And the question is, where there isn't an X, what are they doing? How do they pay their?
Through one of the other providers.
That's what
So
you were
this
saying.
is the way to read this. Maybe
Okay.
I'm gonna have you.
Yeah.
These aren't all the agencies. These are the people doing shared services, largely, as opposed to, you're looking at this as the other chart. What you're saying is,
Okay, I missed that
Department of
too.
Transportation,
These are
who
folks
does
that
their
are
pay?
also
Sorry.
Got it. Now I
This is
understand. Now
just
I
proof
understand
that
your
some of us
comment.
have been here 18 months,
Okay.
we've been here too long.
Right.
So these are the
These are the people that are
ADPs of the
providing
world,
the shared services.
providing the shared services.
Got it.
But Beth, just so.
But if you then take Enrique's question, just to play it out, if we don't have this chart.
Yep.
Are there agencies that are not on one of the, how many did you say? 4?
No, everybody's.
Everybody's on it.
Everybody's on for payroll.
That's what you were
That's what I was getting at. Thank you, Jeff.
So Beth, your ultimate goal, Beth, would be to have the column under financial management have one X that's treasury, right? Would that be do I understand this chart right? No. Is that?
No,
And that's a good.
to have a handful.
Okay.
Year and a half ago, the decision was made 2 years ago to sort of identify 4, in the case of financial services, 4 providers. So we have Interior, Agriculture, Transportation, and Treasury. Beth happens to sit in Treasury, but they also happen to be a provider for financial services. But she really is OMB's agent to drive shared services across the government.
I think so. The goal, though, is to say, how do we, and it may be worth flipping to page 17, Beth, right? I think the process we're on is not to have a single provider for each thing. The needs are sort of complex and somewhat different. Yep. But if you sort of flipped it the other way and said, how do we get agencies to migrate? Mm-hmm. This is the chart that I think you thought the original one is. Yeah. So HUD is on a journey to move their shared services for financial management in a very holistic way to Treasury, the real part of Treasury. DHS is doing some things there's a set of things here. These are the agencies moving things around.
And to give you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but
No, that's the idea.
just a clarification again. What is the transfer price? In other words, if I'm ONB and I'm using Defense Department's payroll system.
Have you been in a big company, Jeff?
Yes, I have. I mean, it's not free, is it, or is it?
No.
No, it is not free.
Okay, so how does that work?
And that will, how about if we walk through this chart and then let's come back, because those are one of several challenges that we're facing.
And people just know, people do move. EPA used to be in Interior. We moved over to DFAST, and a couple of years ago, we moved back to Interior. There are some transaction costs associated with that, but it is really on the point of, one, there's competition, two, is trying to find out which system best meets your particular needs.
For all the reasons we're getting to. Exactly.
So to give you just a little bit of perspective on slide 17, where we were this time last year, to Beth's point, is that the only agency that was actually implementing a financial management shared solution was HUD. And to show some of the momentum that we've actually seen over the past year, the buy-in from some of the agencies, we've actually already moving forward with getting DHS, working with the Interior Department, GSA, working with the Department of Agriculture, Education and Discovery with Treasury, and Commerce also working to start the process for identifying their shared service providers. So seeing a lot of momentum, which I think is actually really demonstrative of the success we've seen, but now we have the challenge of making sure that we're balancing supply and demand correctly, and that we are actually identifying the right ecosystem of providers, and that we can actually satisfy the demand that's coming. So just to talk a little bit about our challenges and frame them up, I think we've talked a little bit about the governance and the need for governance across these lines of business and how we're managing the oversight and creating that marketplace. And then the question, too, becomes around, we've got funding needs. So there are certain limitations that because we actually offer these services within our agencies, there are limitations on how well these agencies can plan and actually scale for what we expect to be the increasing demand. And then there's the kind of more tactical service delivery type of things, which are around quality of service and around transparency. And what I really like about the theme for today is